What Hogwarts house are you in? This is now a pretty common getting to know you question, especially for millennials. And it's actually a really good question, because it gets at what's important to the person and how he or she sees themselves. So it's really interesting that the traits that are associated with 3 of the 4 Hogwarts houses are some of the classic Greek virtues, and the 4th is kind of an inversion of one of those virtues. At Hogwarts, the Sorting Hat decides which house students will belong to, which affects whom they spend their time with while at Hogwarts, since houses share dormitories and common rooms, eat at the same table in the Great Hall, and go to classes together. Each house also has its own Quidditch team, and the houses compete to get the most points in a school year. As Deputy Headmistress Professor McGonagall puts it, a student's house is like his or her family while at Hogwarts. The Magical Sorting Hat explains that each house created by one of the 4 founders is associated with certain virtues. Now each of these 4 founders formed their own house for each, did value different virtues in the ones they had to teach. By Gryffindor, the bravest were prized far beyond the rest. For Ravenclaw, the cleverest would always be the best. For Hufflepuff, hard workers were most worthy of admission, and power-hungry Slytherin loved those of great ambition. In ancient Greece, many philosophers cited 4 key virtues as being morally central, and these are sometimes referred to as the classical virtues: wisdom, temperance, courage, and justice. What's interesting is that 3 of the 4 virtues line up with the traits prized by the respective Hogwarts houses, whereas one of them is kind of the opposite. In this video, I'm going to talk about each of the 4 houses, what traits they value, how we can see those traits in the characters that belong to those houses, and how those traits relate to the classic virtues as discussed by a couple of ancient Greek philosophers. I'm going to focus especially on Aristotle, both because I know him relatively well and because he held virtues as being central to achieving the good life, and thus is known as a virtue ethicist. You might belong in Gryffindor, where dwell the brave at heart. Their daring, nerve, and chivalry set Gryffindors apart. Gryffindor is pretty straightforward. It values the virtue of courage above all, and since the protagonists are in this house, we see a number of characters in it explore the different ways that one can have courage. Neville Longbottom is a fearful boy who learns to stand up for himself even to friends who he thinks are making a mistake. His journey of learning to be brave begins with telling Harry, Ron, and Hermione that they shouldn't be sneaking out at night in the Sorcerer's Stone. It continues when he stands up for himself against the bully Draco Malfoy. It develops further when his parents' torturer, Bellatrix Lestrange, breaks out of Azkaban in the Order of the Phoenix, and he responds by training even harder to be able to fight Death Eaters like her. And finally, the courage that he's developed enables him to serve a key role in defeating Voldemort in the Deathly Hallows. Hermione Granger is a character who values the rules and is very much a goody two-shoes. But she learns to sort out her priorities and break the rules, risking punishment or even expulsion when there's something more important at stake. The most obvious example of this is in the Order of the Phoenix, when she encourages Harry to start an illegal study group for students to learn defense against the dark arts so they'd be prepared in the event of running into one of the villains of the story. And of course, Harry Potter is a very classic hero. He's willing to swallow his fear to face both the smaller anxieties of daily life, such as asking out the girl he likes, and the big terrifying things that come with being the chosen one in a fantasy series, such as dragons, werewolves, basilisks, and even Lord Voldemort himself. Arguably, his bravest moment is at the end when he goes into the forest alone and unarmed so that Voldemort can kill him. J.K. Rowling explained in an interview that courage is her favorite virtue. Now, she's in agreement there with Thucydides, who considered freedom essential to happiness and noted that the only people who could be free are those who have the courage to defend their freedom. There's a slightly inaccurate but catchy quote often attributed to him that goes, "The secret to happiness is freedom, and the secret to freedom is courage." Now, Aristotle, in discussing virtues, thought that each was the mean or the ideal average between a state of excess and a state of deficiency. This is often called the golden mean, but Aristotle never actually used that phrase in his works. In the case of courage, the deficiency is obviously cowardice, whereas the excess is recklessness. Importantly, Aristotle explains that both the deficient and the excessive states are the opposite of the virtues, as well as of each other. Now, we rarely see Gryffindors displaying any kind of cowardice, but we do sometimes see them engage in behavior that might be considered reckless. The Weasley twins often ride this line pretty hard, and they and Harry get into trouble with Professor Umbridge in the books when Harry and George fight with Malfoy after he provokes them by insulting their families. The twins are also so determined to enter the Triwizard Tournament in the Goblet of Fire, despite the safeguards put in place to protect them, that they try to fool the magical age limits and fail. Rowling portrays these as fairly innocent errors, but still errors. They come from a good place, but they are not correct applications of the virtue of courage, and thus there are consequences. You might belong in Hufflepuff, where they are just and loyal. These patient Hufflepuffs are true and unafraid of toil. Although I'm associating Hufflepuff with justice, there are a number of related virtues that are packed in here: work ethic, honesty, patience, and loyalty. This is actually in line with Aristotle's view of justice. He argues that to be just requires all of the other virtues. But in terms of the characters, we don't see too many Hufflepuffs up close, but the ones we do are generally very concerned about justice. The Hufflepuff who gets the most time and attention is Cedric Diggory. And Cedric is obsessed with fairness in his competitions with Harry. When Cedric realizes that his team won the Quidditch match between Hufflepuff and Gryffindor because Harry fell off his broom after seeing the Dementors, he requests a rematch. When Harry helps him by telling him what's coming in the first task of the Triwizard Tournament, Cedric insists on repaying the favor by helping Harry figure out the clue for what's coming in the second task. When Harry saves Cedric in the maze, he says Harry should get the Triwizard Trophy because he couldn't have done it without him. So repeatedly, Cedric is taking actions that seemingly don't benefit him in order to ensure that everything has been fair. Another example of a character we're not 100% sure is a Hufflepuff, but her family is Amelia Bones, and she is one of the judges that Harry faces in the Order of the Phoenix. Before Harry does face her, Mr. Weasley tells him that Amelia Bones is okay, she's fair, she'll hear you out. So there again we see, presumably, a Hufflepuff's commitment to justice. Justice is typically considered an extremely important virtue, but the Greek philosophers did not agree on what justice precisely is. Aristotle sets forth a few different ways of approaching the issue. In the Eudemian Ethics, he describes it as the correct point between seeking profit from every possible source and being meek and unwilling to pursue profit to the point of often accepting losses. Elsewhere, he discusses it as a kind of reciprocity, or a means of balancing the scales. Plato, after long discussions of the issue, comes to the conclusion that justice is when each part of an individual's soul or a city sticks to its particular role, doing its job and either ruling or submitting as appropriate. In other words, it's each part having and doing its own, he says. Rowling focuses less on what justice actually means and more on the character's commitment to justice as such. Or yet, in wise old Ravenclaw, if you've a ready mind, where those of wit and learning will always find their kind. Again, we don't see as many Ravenclaw characters up close, but we do see a couple of different approaches to the love of learning that is emblematic of Ravenclaw House. We see the book-smart Ravenclaws, who care a lot about their classes and reading, and we also see the more open-minded Ravenclaws, who seek knowledge in strange ways, and are sometimes perhaps too willing to believe things without evidence. One cool example of Ravenclaw's commitment to wisdom is how they get into their common room. All of the other houses to get into their common rooms, they have a password, but for Ravenclaw, there's a riddle for you to solve. If you don't get the riddle right, you have to wait until someone who does comes along. So although it may put you into a bit of a tough spot if you can't get in, each time that you go into your common room or your dorm is potentially a chance for you to learn. I want to emphasize as well that it's not just about being smart, but about prioritizing knowledge, which goes along with one of the themes of the entire series, that it's not about your abilities or what you're born with, it's about the choices that you make. Hermione, for example, is extremely smart, but when she demonstrates a very advanced spell and a Ravenclaw asks why she isn't in Ravenclaw, she replies that it was her choice to be in Gryffindor. It's about what she prioritizes more than her abilities. Philosophy as we now know it grew out of Greek's love of learning. The word comes from the Greek words for love and wisdom, Philos and Sophia. Aristotle, who wrote extensively not only on all the areas of philosophy but also on biology and logic, emphasized that using our minds, our reasoning faculty, is what makes us different from other animals, and thus we should do this really well if we want to be good humans. This is sometimes called the excellence argument, or the argument from excellence. A good knife is one that cuts well, for example. And using observation and reason, Aristotle argues, is how we gather knowledge, which we need to live good lives. So we need to do that well if we want to live really good lives. Similarly, Socrates is said to have thought that the unexamined life is not worth living, and to have sought knowledge by pestering people and trying to get them to think more clearly about the concepts they were using. In both cases, it's not about whatever your natural intelligence is, it's about the way you go about seeking knowledge. Or perhaps in Slytherin, you'll make your real friends. These cunning folks use any means to achieve their ends. Slytherin's key trait, ambition, is actually kind of the opposite of the fourth classic Greek virtue, which is temperance. Temperance isn't a common word now, but it's basically the opposite of gluttony. Not total abstinence of pleasure. Almost no Greeks believed in that. But not indulging too frequently in rich foods, sex, expensive items, and those kinds of pleasant things. Interestingly, Rowling said in an interview that the sin she's most willing to forgive is gluttony, so perhaps that's part of why she strayed from this particular virtue. It wasn't one she could connect with personally. Slytherins are definitely not hedonists, but they do typically believe that they deserve the good life, and most aren't too interested in making sure that they're just or honest in how they get it. Now, it's worth noting that this is definitely not the only way to look at ambition. You can be super ambitious but never even consider getting ahead by treating others unjustly. Nevertheless, that's the stereotype, and we'll see how it plays out with a few key Slytherins momentarily. We also need to address that House Slytherin has a common bigotry that began with its founder, an obsession with so-called purebloods. In fact, no student with 2 Muggle parents is allowed to join the house. This is unrelated to the core traits of the house, but the sense of false superiority that obsession gives some of them does add to their arrogance and sense of entitlement. Professor Horace Slughorn, who was previously a head of Slytherin House and who rejoins the faculty in the 6th book, is obsessed with having influence over the rich and powerful. He doesn't really care about being in the spotlight himself, he'd rather be like the king's advisor, whispering in other people's ears. He builds up quite a network throughout his time as a teacher, then sits back and reaps the rewards as his chosen few succeed. He's not a bad teacher, but Slughorn's real focus is power via influence, gaining pseudo-self-esteem by living vicariously through his students and their achievements, and he can be dismissive and even unpleasant to those he doesn't think have much potential. He's not as bigoted as some Slytherins. He's perfectly happy to have Muggle-born such as Lily Potter and Hermione Granger, or blood traders such as Ginny Weasley in his circle if they're magically powerful or smart enough. The Malfoys, on the other hand, are a rich and proudly pure blood family. Lucius Malfoy uses his wealth to buy him influence at the Ministry of Magic. He's not exactly a caring father, and he worms his way out of trouble after the First Wizarding War by pretending he was under the Imperius Curse. In truth, he's primarily a power luster, and he was following the power that Voldemort had been building. His wife Narcissa also comes from a proud, pure-blood family, but she's rather a doting mother. She spoils Draco a bit, and the boy grows up with a sense of entitlement and a need to prove himself to his parents and to the Dark Lord. Draco is also a clear case of having poor self-esteem and trying to cover it up with bigotry. For example, in the Chamber of Secrets, he calls Hermione a mudblood only after she suggests that he's not very good at Quidditch. Though the Malfoys crave power, they do end up putting their family first, as exemplified particularly by Narcissa lying about Harry being dead to Voldemort during the Battle of Hogwarts so that she could go back to the castle and look for Draco. Whether that's their complex about being purebloods leading them to prizing their family, or genuine love is not 100% clear, but Narcissa is willing to risk a lot for Draco near the end. Professor Snape, the head of Slytherin House, is perhaps the most complicated and debated character. What he wants more than anything, unlike many other Slytherins, is not power or influence. He wants revenge on Voldemort after Voldemort kills his teenage love Lily Potter. In a lesser sense, he's also very unpleasant to Harry, who reminds him of James Potter, because in Snape's eyes, James took his love Lily from him. Revenge, I would argue, is a way of trying to take back control of a situation, but it's a much more personal quest for control than the other Slytherins we've discussed, because he doesn't want control over everything, just that which relates to Lily. Ambition overall, I would argue, is a broad and sometimes misunderstood term. For some Slytherins, like Slughorn, they want influence over others, but for some, it's more about their personal lives and desires. What binds all the Slytherins together is really how much they're willing to do, how much they're willing to give up or to risk for what they want. And though Rowling seems to regard this as a negative trait, since the villains are primarily Slytherins, it does seem to me that if a person were bearing in mind certain ethical guidelines and set his or her sights on a good thing, then the determination of Slytherins would be a massive force for good. Whether a person should want a lot for his or her life was a topic of debate in ancient Greece. Epicurus and his follower Lucretius argued against being ambitious, saying you should only strive enough to avoid pain and suffering. The Stoics thought valuing things or people set you up to be disappointed, so you certainly shouldn't be ambitious. Aristotle, on the other hand, thought that eudaimonia, flourishing, came from being virtuous and achieving a certain amount of material wealth, and that one should strive endlessly toward that goal. Few of us today talk about the classic virtues the way that the ancient Greek philosophers did, but many of us do think about what kind of behavior we think is moral and what we care about most, which is, I think, part of why this particular feature of the Harry Potter universe is so fascinating to us. Ancient Greek philosophy is now thousands of years old, but its ideas and lessons continue to be relevant and to affect pop culture today, and the timeless virtues included in it are still essential to being a good person.